going to run the slides, so then when Tom is presenting, he'll just tell me when to move forward. For those of you online, as well as in the room, if you want to get it, if not, we'll email it to you. That's not a problem. I just put the link to the slide deck in the chat. So if you want to look at the slides now or later, you're welcome to. Share this. So Maggie, we can go ahead and start recording if you haven't already.
I just started it. Yep.
All right. So welcome, everyone. I'm Casey Raymond. I was in the first cohort of Accessibility Fellows in 2019. And this past year and coming year, I'm the coordinator for the Faculty Accessibility Fellows program. I'm also on the work group for accessibility practices in the steering committee. Tom, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm a professor and a faculty member in the School of Business. I've been teaching online courses since 1998, I believe. And as I will indicate later, I've learned after being a faculty fellow how much I don't know yet about designing courses, at least for accessibility and inclusivity reasons. But I'm glad to be here.
So the goal of today's presentation is really just to kind of give an introduction to particularly digital accessibility and to touch on a few pieces and components that will get highlighted in other sessions throughout the next 2 weeks. And so, of course, one of the first things is, what is accessibility? And a few years ago, a lot of folks were like, well, I mean, students can download things from the web. And it's like, well, yes, that is part of it. But accessibility really is about making anything, whether it's digital content or a store, anything available to anyone under any circumstances. All right. A lot of our discussion today is going to focus on digital accessibility, so digital content, but accessibility crosses all aspects of daily life. And it really is something that should be proactive. And it is about social justice, and it's about being inclusive. And this is a very common cartoon that we show in some of the discussions, because it really, demonstrates what accessibility should be. If you shovel this ramp first, everybody can get into the school. Where shoveling the stairs leaves someone out. And so we really want accessibility to just become that automatic. Okay, yep, you do the ramp, then you go back and do the stairs, and everybody benefits. And this is an example of a physical situation, but in the digital content, the same kinds of principles hold. And so, here's another example. The automatic doors work for everyone. In this case, it's showing someone with a wheelchair, but even someone pushing a cart. If you've ever tried to open a door pushing a cart, it's not simple. Or your hands loaded down with bags of content. The really important thing is that accessibility is the right thing to do, because it will work for anyone under any circumstance. And what seems to be surprising to many people is that 1 in 5 Americans have some form of a disability. And this number might actually be creeping closer to 1 in 4 have some form of a disability that would benefit from accessible content, accessible structures. And so this isn't just a 1 in 100 type of situation. It affects everyone. And there's a whole range of types of disabilities. Some are physical, some are more mental. And the other big part of keeping in mind this list of disabilities and the need for accessible content is that the type of disability ranges. There are certainly permanent disabilities, such as an amputation. But if you have shoulder surgery and you have to keep your arm immobilized, eventually you should be able to move your arm. That's a temporary situation. If your hands are loaded down with grocery bags, that's a situational disability. And so it's really, really important for us to recognize there is a huge range of situations and conditions that require things to be accessible. And some of them are temporary and some of them are permanent. But if we do things so that it is accessible, you're covering all of these situations and conditions without additional effort, so to speak.
May I add a comment?
Yep.
Casey?
Yep.
One does not have to be disabled to need some of these accessibility features. Individuals for whom English is their second or perhaps even their third language, the kind of strategies one can use to increase the likelihood that they can understand what you're saying and the points you're trying to make is also just as important for them.
Absolutely. So our campus has really focused in the last several years on 5 principles, because the area of accessibility and digital accessibility is huge. And it can be absolutely overwhelming. We recognize that. And so we've really focused on 5 things, 5 areas that can have a huge effect without a large amount of work involved for us in creating material. And so the 5 areas or the 5 principles that we're going to touch on today and show you some quick examples of that will get discussed in future breakout sessions, or there's huge amounts of tutorial information on, are structured content, text equivalents for be it images or equations, color contrast and using color in a reasonable way, contextual hyperlinks, and using plain language. All right, so we're going to kind of just touch on each of these 5 components. But if you keep these 5 things in mind as you're creating content and you approach each of these 5 things as you're creating the content, you are greatly improving the material you want to be accessible. And for most of these, you'll see that it really doesn't take a lot of effort. It just takes a slight shift in how you work. All right. So in terms of structured content, it really means that you use things like headings and you use lists. And as an example, and you'll see it in an example on a show, you might be able to see how content is structured. But if you are wanting to listen to it in an audio format, you probably aren't looking at it, right? Whether it's in your car, whether it's exercising, whether you need content read to you. The headings and the lists and that structure help those users move through the content. All right. And headings and lists are actually very easy to get incorporated in Word, in Google Docs, and in a lot of content creation materials. And so here's 2 examples of a written recipe. Which do you find most useful?
One on the right.
The one on the right. Okay. I mean, it looks like we might see a recipe and so forth, but really the one on the left it's all the same content. It just so happens that the one on the left is not structured and the one on the right is structured. And so, this is a pretty stark example for what structured content can do for you. All right. And so, as I said, we'll dig into this deeper at a session later this week, but it's something that you really want to be aware of. Without the structure, without the headings, without the list designations, if you wanted this read to you, in the car, it's just going to read it like this, and there's no way to hop around like, oh, I need to finish my grocery list. What are the ingredients? All right. So this is just one quick example of where structured content can have a huge benefit. The idea of text equivalence. You really want to provide content about whatever image or audio or video or multimedia you've put in a document. It should be addressed somewhere in the prose of the text. Otherwise, why is it there? If you're not writing about it or presenting that information to your audience, then why is that content present? And it could be just because it looks nice, decorative, it breaks up the page. And there are ways to indicate to your audience that an image is just decorative. But it gets a little tricky sometimes with text equivalence. How much detail do you provide? And it all centers on what's the purpose of the image? How much information did you give in other parts of the document relative to the image? And why is that image present in terms of the content you might provide? And so next slide, here's an image. What do you suppose alt text would be?
That's not a rhetorical question.
Not a rhetorical question.
Logo of the State University of New York.
So we could identify it as a logo. If it was just there as letterhead, you might actually just refer to it as decorative because you might have State University of New York in text elsewhere, right? And so I'm doing this to demonstrate two things. One, the alt text can vary depending greatly on the use, right? And two, just throwing an image up sometimes isn't very helpful, right? So you really need to understand the context of the image to understand what the alt text should be, right? We're in no way saying avoid using images in your content. That's not what we're saying. But if you're putting a lot of images in just for aesthetics and appearance to the eye, that might not be as efficient either, right? So it's a balance. I'm going to let Tom talk a little bit about the next few things.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll just go back to, excuse me, I'll just go back to the logo for a minute. Now, I am currently president of the Oswego Rotary Club, and Rotary International just this past year changed its logo. And for the folks at Rotary International, sometimes I think they go a bit far, that is very, very important that we use the current logo and not past ones. So if I were to show an image in some type of a presentation or an email or a PowerPoint, for those people who are visually impaired or perhaps blind, I would probably write quite a lot in the alt text about what it looks like and how it's different from before, as opposed to decorative. It just depends, as Casey said, it depends upon the purpose for which you're showing it. Casey? Now, color can really be helpful in making your digital content more accessible than not having used it. All one has to do, and it's a matter of contrast. I purposely created 3 different statements, all the same here. Nothing rocket science about this. No rocket science here, but look at this. Quite frankly, Black on white or white on black is going to provide you about the best contrast you'll ever get. So if you're speaking of text. Now, sometimes you do want to make whatever you're saying a little bit more decorative, and you can do that. You can do that with colors, but use the right colors. If I were to rank these from 1 to 3 in terms of how accessible they are, obviously the top would be the first most highly ranked. The second one, I think I checked that, and I believe that does pass the accessibility standards. And the third one does not. The third one does not. People with any type of visual impairment that's other than insignificant are going to find that very, very difficult to read that last one. Now, why is it so important anyway? Well, as I said, those with visual deficiencies can be aided in their ability to read text or to understand images. And the use of color can be used to help them. For instance, next. Okay, now the question becomes, I'd like to go back.
Oops, sorry, Tom.
The question becomes, how do we do it? Well, I can see why Casey went ahead because I pretty much answered this before. How do we use color to make one's digital experience more accessible? We try to create, if we decided to use color, we're going to create a combination of colors with enough contrast so that each element of the content on the page is clearly distinguishable. And that's true. That's true for both for images and for textual passages. If we may go ahead. Okay, and for colors, well, the thing to do is pair a light color and a dark color. And there are tools that can be used that are available that Casey will be briefly speaking of, I believe, Friday morning or Friday when he gives his presentation on contrast and color that will tell you whether you meet the current accessibility standards. In other words, whether there's enough contrast between your blue and your orange so that most people can distinguish between them and read even easier. Sometimes, for whatever reason, you may wish to pair colors that are somewhat similar in their shade. Well, then definitely use the color contrast tools to check if you meet the accessibility standard. Right now, it depends. Minimal standards are a contrast of 4.5 to 1. Casey will probably be talking about what that means on Friday. But here we have 3 examples, okay? The top one, boy, that's hard to read. 2.1, that would not meet an accessibility standard for anybody. The next one is minimal. It does, it's okay, but it would be much better to use the bottom one with a contrast ratio of 7.1. You see how much easier that is? And as I said, there are tools that can be used to plug that right in and tell you what the color contrast ratio is. Next, please. So in terms of an image, look at the difference. Look at the difference. I didn't come up with these images, but good to see that they use a sports image. I like that. The Jets used to play football, I understand. But anyway, you can see the difference is much easier here. Next.
Yeah.
Don't rely solely on color, though. Color can mess you up sometimes. Let me give you an example. This may not be the time to bring it up, but when Casey and I spoke about this presentation, he already had a template set up. And I went in and added some slides and changed some slides for what I would be speaking of. And I said, you know what? It was black and white. white background, black letters. And I said, I'm going to jazz this up. And so I used a gold. Boy, it's pretty, really nice looking as a background. He informed me, I didn't even think about this, how embarrassing when I was to talk about color and the use of colors. He informed me that the way I had made the changes did not meet the color contrast accessibility standards. So be careful. There are other ways to increase accessibility other than color at times as well. There's no question about that. Next. One of them is if you're talking about text, is bolding it. Now, we have two examples here, one in blue and one in yellow. I would say that I'm not sure, I didn't check it, if the top line would meet the color contrast accessibility standard, but it would be close. And if it did meet it, it would just barely do it. The next line would for sure. On the bottom, well, at least you can, if you have good eyesight, you can read the yellow in the bold. It's almost impossible to in the non-bold. Now, having said that, to go back to what I mentioned before, that yellow, neither one of them is going to work, though. I just wanted to make the point of show you how bold text does help you. Next slide. Okay, now we go to the next area, the contextual hyperlinks, which is a nice fancy term. What we're talking about is you often, I'm sure, or at least in your course, in your web courses, and in your PowerPoint presentations, as we did here, you may not have seen it yet, but we did, provide some links to other areas on the web. All right, or to images, to other text, to articles, what have you. Make sure that the person knows beforehand what she or he is likely to see, rather than saying, please click here. All right. In other words, write a sentence, or at least use a phrase that if someone else were looking for this issue, they probably would use a phrase something like that. For instance, Casey. All right, we have three different announcements and invitations to register for the WRVO Community Potluck Dinner. The first two, they meet the standard I just mentioned easily. The first one was a little bit more wordy. Please register for the community potluck by going to. So now you know what you're going to be getting. All right, or please register. Now I prefer the second, but myself because of looks. But I have to tell you that putting in the actual URL can be very helpful. When Pam Maher was at this institution and was responsible for online delivery and assessing various aspects of online courses, she tried to convince me for every link I had to put in the actual link, so that even apart from visual impairments, so that if someone if there's a mistake or something, someone can see what the link was and be able to get to it. I still haven't got there yet. I'll be honest. I go for the second strategy myself, but it certainly is more than appropriate to use the top one. But clicking here for the community potluck, it doesn't really tell you that you're going to register. It doesn't tell you enough. Give a preview. Give a preview of what you're going to do. Next slide.
And I'm just going to add as well here that one of the things, if you're going to have a document that is going to get printed, then yeah, you really kind of want to give them the full URL or a QR code or something like that, because they can't on a printed thing click this register. But anything that's digital that might be read to the user, this is much more efficient because it'll talk about, please link to register for the WRVO picnic, as opposed to Potluck by going to http://. So a screen reader in this top example will read the actual address letter by letter, which would be really annoying if you had a whole bunch of links. So
now that's why we have Casey as the expert, because I never thought of that. There are depending upon your audience.
And the question from the audience in South, is it appropriate to do both links in the same sentence? If it's something that's going to be primarily digital or exclusively digital, then just use this example. If it's something that it's going to get set up in multiple ways, then yeah, you probably do want to find a way to include the full URL. But when it really comes down to it, it's probably an unusual situation where you're going to be generating content that really is intended to be given in both the digital format and the print format at exactly the same time in exactly the same way. And this is, I put in the chat in response to a question that Jackie had, or a statement that Jackie had about working with interns. I think one of the big things that we all really need to learn to consider is that there is a huge difference between something we intend for users to interact with on the printed page and something we intend users to interact with in a digital format. And that's where you really want to kind of keep in mind which you do, right? Would it be disastrous to have both? No. One of the questions becomes, I would say, in this top example, if we also made register a link and had the URL below it, where it might get confusing is, are they the same link? Do they take you to the same place? One strategy there, if you really wanted to be sure the URL was available, is I would probably say register in parentheses the URL and parentheses and make that whole thing the link. Okay. But I honestly would avoid it if I otherwise. All right. So I would just go, Julia.
The trouble that I sometimes have is I intend for users to interact with an electronic document and then they print it.
Right. Like a syllabus.
So then making it accessible in both ways can be useful in that instance because they're doing something that I didn't expect them to do. And so then a question could be, can you indicate to a screen reader to not read the link that you've typed out and to only read the register link? So if you put both options and just indicate that the screen reader doesn't read part of it.
I'm not sure that it's doable. And it's the other unfortunate thing is that type of situation is going to become screen reader dependent, probably, right, in terms of how that screen reader functions.
Yeah, it's a coding problem.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the statement that I was kind of alluding to is if you're intending something to be digital or primarily digital, that's the way it kind of should be. But if you know that somebody might print it, is you might generate a second document that is print only that has that. And I've done that some with syllabi, and we just identified this is a print only. This is for printing. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be accessible in a digital way. But this is a good example of how tricky or complicated accessibility can actually become and how how there are so many different situations that you might have to address. And as we get towards the end of this presentation, and we kind of keep saying is, that's why we focus on these 5 things, and we try to keep them not basic, but pretty straightforward, because just accomplishing many of these 5 things will immediately make your content much more accessible. Poon, do you have a question related to this?
Yeah, something related to this. Is there a way to control which browser the link opens into? Because most of the time, it opens through Safari for Mac, and then and then it opens in my Internet Explorer. Some of the links are not accessible through those, so it does not open properly. So can we control that?
We cannot control that. That is set by the individual user at the individual device they're using. Now, they can change that. And if you are well aware that there is a browser conflict or a browser problem, you can make your users aware that these things should really be open in this browser, and either help them change their default browser or have them work with the help desk at CTS to change their default browser if it really is a significant issue.
Yeah, in the lab documents that I've created with my collaborators, we have a statement about which browsers they should be using to access all the websites.
So in that case, having a URL, providing a URL will help, right, to copy and paste in case.
Yep, there are ways to do it electronically as well, though. But you're right. Tom, I'll send it back to you.
What would you say, Casey, would be the preferred? Chrome? Don't we usually suggest Chrome as one of the browsers that works well?
Chrome, Firefox, and Safari, to my understanding, are all quite accessible. I have not used the new Microsoft Edge very extensively, but it is basically Chrome. So it should be okay as well. Internet Explorer, if anyone's still using an old version of Internet Explorer, it probably is not going to work very well.
So you should probably use one of those and suggest to your students that they do as well. The point is, of the earlier discussion, as to 1 or 2 uses of the contextual links, it depends upon the objective for which you have created the link, I think. And here's one in terms of the fifth principle, using plain language. Well, first of all, know your audience. Some of these tips you may see or interpret as, well, I've got to dummy everything down. Well, I'm not sure that's the case. It depends upon your audience. But don't make assumptions that everyone in your audience will understand every word of jargon that you use, etc. So these are tips that you're aware of in everyday writing and in everyday speaking. But what are some tips? Just keep in mind, especially when you're creating digital content. Well, one is use words you fully understand, because then it's more like the others will. I cannot forget my good friend, freshman in college at St. Lawrence University, more years ago than I will admit to. We took the same composition class. He wrote, and after the first assignment, before he turned it in, he said, Tom, I want you to look at this. And his essay, and I said, well, I think what you said, the content's good. You make a point. It's understandable. Your organization is good. But why all these big fancy words? Oh, he said, well, I just write a draft. Then I go to the thesaurus and I look up fancier words to put in. All right. Truthfully, he became an attorney. For whatever that means. I come from a family of attorneys. They usually don't write that way. They have to write quite concisely. But really, that's true. Don't use a $10 word when you can use a 5-cent word as well. Avoid the use of unnecessary words. What's an example? My mind's gone blank right now. But sometimes, I'm going out golfing because it's raining out today. Well, first of all, you don't have to say I'm going out golfing because you're not going to golf inside. Secondly, you probably should say play golf instead of golfing, but that's another issue. And because it's raining outside, well, it doesn't rain inside. So, I mean, that's, try to be more concise. Brevity helps. As was implied before, jargon. Only use jargon if you know that your audience, every person in your audience has the same background as you do. So try to avoid it as much as you can. And of course, try to write in the active voice. I mean, there's a whole lot written about active versus passive voice, but it comes through much better when you, I actually had fifth. I made a mistake here. There's two of them right here. Writing in the active voice really helps. Passive voice usually is used when you don't want to emphasize the person who is making the point. But other than that, you should write the active voice. And also try to avoid, should have been a fifth one, my mistake, I missed it in going over it. Limit your use of modifiers such as very and extremely. Take a moment and choose the adjective that better suits you rather than saying very pretty. Use gorgeous, beautiful, what have you. That type of a thing. Yeah, no, that's just a few of them. Yes, if we can go on. Okay, well, what have I learned since becoming a faculty fellow? As I said before, I learned that there is so much that I still have to learn about making web courses accessible, about making PowerPoints accessible, etc. Of making printed text accessible, more accessible. But I have learned that as much as I've done to try to make my web courses accessible, there still is a great deal more that I can do. This was brought up, I think, by Carrie from Extended Learning last year. Carrie and Teresa. The objective should be continuous improvement. If you try to make your course 100% accessible, you will not eat or sleep, but continuously try to make it better. It's not that difficult to do most of these things, although some of them do take time. I have a great deal of, I put a lot of images in my courses. One of the things I do is I put in cartoons, and then I ask my students to explain in their words what they think the point of the cartoon as it relates to whatever concept we're talking about. Equity theory, transformational leadership, what have you. Well, I've got to go back and improve what I have in the alt text, because I pretty much would say cartoon dealing with transformational leadership, but that doesn't help a person who can't see, who's visually impaired and can't see it. It definitely doesn't help a person who's blind. And I really need to describe what's taking place in the cartoon and describe it fairly specifically. So some of these things can take time, but they're worth it. So I guess the main point I learned is there are hundreds of ways to make your courses accessible, and you should work at trying to do that, but one day at a time.
And it leads this summary pretty well that, design with accessibility in mind. And, there's a lot of small steps that we can take that have a big impact. And then as you need to do some of the more complicated things for whatever your content is, you start building from there. Tom, do you want me to show this?
Yeah, go ahead. You've got the controls. I found this website. Let's just see, for instance, oswego.edu. Let's just see how it passes the test. Okay, it will take a web page, and it will show you how you're doing. And here, SUNY Oswego's has no errors. It does have 4 alerts, probably in terms of headings. Click on the diamond there, would you?
Yeah, I gotta go to details.
Yeah, okay. And then yeah, these tend to be, one of them skipping a heading that would help. Now you're getting, I think, right into the design of the web page, which is beyond my means, but it does tell you that there's an issue. Well, it does. Actually, I shouldn't say that, because if you know that you're missing, it shows you where you're missing the heading, and you can go back and put that in. What about we have a web page dealing with design accessibility, don't we? Let's see how that goes. Yeah, digital accessibility. We have some headings that they say we skip. That always happens.
A couple more alerts, but by and large, no errors.
But you can go to others, maybe some of your own, and find, oh no, there's a number of errors that you should be. So it's always a good idea that's a nice check to use. All yours, Casey.
And then, as we alluded to, there is this page for digital accessibility that has developed over several years, particularly thanks to Kate DeForest and others. But a couple of things I want to highlight here. One, the basic principles are here that we've just talked about, with pull downs and some additional information. All right. There is the FAQ, but there is a huge resource bank of tutorials, both written and video, on how to handle certain components of accessibility, how to do it within different software applications, and so forth. There's also this link that gives you information on the Campus Accessibility Initiative and the groups that are involved. All right. And so there's really 4 primary groups involved with digital accessibility on campus. There's the steering committee, there's the work group, there's the web steering committee, and then there's the faculty accessibility fellows program. And within each of these, it gives you who the folks on the committee are. So you can reach out to any of these folks if you have questions about accessible content and so forth. And either we can help or we can get you pointed to the right direction. All right. Last thing I wanted to highlight are upcoming presentations dealing with accessibility for this winter breakout session. And so there's one this afternoon that's going to be presented by Michelle Thornton, looking into the accessibility and Brightspace combination, because many of us are using Brightspace. And so how do these work together? Tomorrow, we have an outside presenter that's going to talk about accessibility and Word, particularly Word documents, in the morning. If you use Word a lot, I really encourage you to attend that. In the afternoon, he's going to focus more on PDFs and managing PDFs in an accessible way. This one, I'll be clear, is a little more advanced. If you don't do much with PDFs other than occasionally open them and view them or print to a PDF, it might be more than you're ready to bite off. But if you do need to deal with a lot of PDFs, this is available tomorrow afternoon. Especially the one tomorrow afternoon, please register in advance. Wednesday, Laura Harris is going to talk about some disability models and sort of the range of disabilities that can come into play that require accessible content. In the afternoon, I'll talk about this structured content specifically with Google Docs and Word and how you can structure your content in those packages. And on Friday morning, as Tom alluded to, I'll talk about color and contrast and some of the details that are involved there. And then next Tuesday, Kate is going to give a presentation on what we've been talking about, how to make really small changes in what you do that have a big impact. We don't want to overwhelm everybody. We want people to be able to create content that's accessible, but in a manageable way. And then Michael Chanis was the other accessibility fellow this past year. And he's putting together a presentation on accessibility for the inaccessible, and really kind of focusing on the impact that accessible content can have, even when it's not required by a legal accommodation. Notice we've sort of avoided the whole idea of accommodation because that's different. You know, accessible content is just available for anyone and everyone, even if they don't realize that it's beneficial to them. And that's one of the things that Michael will be talking about next Tuesday. So that's the list of upcoming sessions related to accessibility. And if you've got particular interests, hopefully one of those is there. And if there's something missing that you really want to know more about, reach out to one of the accessibility folks on campus and we can help you from there. All right. And that's all we had for this session. You know, we're happy to answer any other questions. I'll make sure I get emailed out the link to these slides so that folks have it if they need it. But happy to answer questions.
Casey, I know I'll have more questions as the sessions go on. I feel like this was a very nice introduction. That's why I'm not responding, not because it wasn't good. I just don't have any right now.
Totally fair. And I'll be honest, this is a presentation that has been kind of assembled with folks in the work group and Michelle Thornton and you know, over years, and we just kind of keep adjusting it a little bit to the presenters or each year. And you know, our goal is just to make folks aware of what the 5 principles are, how they might be impacted, and how you can manage those at a 10,000 foot level. And then for the cases where you're really not sure, we'll give you more detailed advice to dive in on. So thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks, thank you.
So